already know this, but the amount of time that is lost in just planning and trying to find all the parts that you need, and then realizing that one of those won't work, so you got to take it back and find another solution. It is insane with a project of this size, but this is what we signed up for. There's a fun part of it too. There's a creative element. It's just, man, when you put yourself under any sort of like a time deadline, you really feel every trip where you leave the house and you are not producing stuff in the shop. I woke up super inspired today. I'm all hopped up on caffeine, and with the creative juices going and having a bunch of parts here that I just went out and got, I've got a whole bunch of new ideas and ways to problem solve some of this stuff. So instead of making our power steering somehow fit under like where the AC mount was, I mean, we've got this whole side of the block that's open. So this is gonna be like the most complicated bracket that I've ever built. But what I'm thinking is that we take advantage of we have so many threaded bolt holes on the side of the block and on the face of the block, that if we, instead of having two separate mounts, so placing the power steering pump somewhere and placing an engine mount here, I could tie it all together into one mount, reach out and just grab tons of bolt holes and make like one really strong mount that's gonna be for both. It's gonna be complicated to build, but it's gonna, once it's all done, I'll be so thankful that I have so much more space for the power steering pump. I think I'm gonna add an idler like right here, so we have like maximum amount of wrap of our serpentine belt around this pulley, just to avoid any sort of like squeaks and squeals from the power steering, which we all hate. So anyway, I've got plenty of caffeine flowing through my veins. I'm gonna start cutting up some cardboard templates and drilling some holes. The alternator, belt tensioner, and the crank, of course, are all just factory Volkswagen parts. But what we're adding on the other side is a TC style power steering pump. And the reason I like this style is because there's a few aftermarket companies that have super high flow versions of this pump. And then we're gonna add some idlers, or at least one idler, that come factory with the Jeep TJ. And the reason that I'm using these idlers as opposed to others is simply it's the same 6-rib serpentine belt, just like you would get on a Volkswagen TDI. You gotta let me know what you think. Is this brilliant or is this hacky? I've done this before and it worked pretty dang good, just to add one pulley, but we're adding a couple. But here's my theory. The back of the pulley to the first rib is the same on all three of these pulleys, right? And everything needs to be indexed off of the crank pulley. But the front of the crank pulley is like, it's super thick between here and the first rib, and then it's thinner from here to the first rib, and it's like medium from there. So my theory is if I can anchor everything to where it's like across the back and it's anchored in nice and tight on the back of that pulley, let's see, there you go, then it's going to help me index this pulley to the crank pulley, and then I even threw one across the front, because once I threw it across the front, I realized that it lined up perfectly. And so just to give it a little bit more square ability, I clamped that one down. And I don't know, we're going to tack it in and see what happens. The next step after I get this tacked in the way I want it is we're going to add an idler pulley like right there. I'm building the majority of this bracket out of 3/16 plate, and many of you know I'm a huge fan of 3/16. It's not quite as big and heavy as 1/4 inch, but it's much more rigid than 1/8. The only exception is there is one piece of 3/8, which is super thick, and I did that right behind the back of the pump, and it's because I actually physically cut threads into that plate, and that's going to make it much easier to install and uninstall the pump later on down the road. I wanted to keep the difference between the crank pulley and the power steering pulley within 1/2 degree. But after playing around with it for a little while, I was able to get it within 1/10 degree. This is my friend Kelly from Muddy Beards. He's one of my oldest friends, and he just inherited my old axle from the TJ. So I know TJ fans are mad that I'm tearing this thing apart, or at least disappointed that I'm not working on it yet. But later this year, you're going to see this thing is going to be a completely ground up build. As for the axle, I know a lot of you reached out saying dibs. Kelly had dibs on this a very, very long time ago, and so he's putting it in a 4-door S10 rock lander build that is going to be so sweet. So I highly recommend you go over to Muddy Beards, check out his channel. Now, let's talk about this drive assembly. I solved a couple problems and created a couple other ones. Let's start with the positives. The positive is we have a drive assembly, and I'm 99% sure this is going to work. So we've added 2 idlers, and for those of you that don't know, these idlers are here to help maximize the amount of wrap of the serpentine belt around these pulleys that are driving different, parts, important systems in the vehicle. So if we started from the alternator, the serpentine belt's going to go down under the crank pulley, and because we have this idler here, it's going to come up the crank pulley farther than if we would have just connected it from here to there. So now because it goes over this idler, we're going to have more inches of grip essentially on our crank pulley. It's going to go around this guy. Now we're going to maximize even more grip around our power steering pulley. And then with this idler here, I mean, you can see we're going to wrap way around that power steering pulley, which is great. That's exactly what we want. Then it's going to go underneath this idler and then across our tensioner and back up to the alternator. The tensioner, it has a pin that has it locked like in tension position or whatever. It's locked up and out of the way right now. Once we pull this pin, this will swing down. So I know it looks like the routing here is going to be weird, but once this swings down straight, the belt should work perfect. Now, we have problems and solutions. We've already made solutions for the space between our oil pan and this front diff. Because we pulled the axle forward, the part that's closest to the oil pan is now a smaller part of the front diff. That gave us some space. We clocked the engine and we scooted the engine over passenger like 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, somewhere in there. And because of that, that freed up some space between the oil pan and the front diff. And I positioned I positioned the engine higher in the engine bay, basically as high as I could get it. It does touch the hood. That is one of the problems we have to deal with. But I saw this coming 2 months ago and I ordered parts to deal with this. So as you can see, It just barely touches the hood, man. Like, it's not that bad. I think that it's just contacting this ribbing a little bit. So what I did is, since I saw this coming, I ordered this really cool hood scoop. It's like a Malaysian Suzuki Samurai market hood scoop. The first one got canceled after a week for no reason, and then I ordered another one, and then that one got canceled a month and a half later, which was last week. So I found one of these hood scoops in Malaysia. It's way more money, but it's from a company that's actually emailing me or messaging me back and forth. So 99% sure that we got it this time. So that one, it's gonna be on its way, hopefully next week. So that'll help solve the problem with this. It'll give us some cool style points. I like weird Asian, weird JDM stuff. So this, to me, is gonna match that front grille perfect, and it's just gonna help give this vehicle character. Now, I did put some spacers under, whenever I built the mounts, I figure you could make it taller with spacers, but you can't shrink it down. So I built it where I thought the engine would work best, but that's with spacers. So just in case I made a mistake and I do have to drop the engine down, I can remove these two spacers and get the engine to sit a little bit lower in the engine bay. But I don't think that's gonna be a problem. Now, we have a transfer case that just showed up. I'm gonna try to get that mounted. Hopefully we don't have too many problems, but because of how weird the offset is of this front axle, I have a feeling we're gonna have some problems. Instead of using my big, heavy Atlas 4-speed transfer case for the Samurai build, I think that it's more fitting to use this Midnight Metalworks D300 rock box. Now, this is a relatively new company in the scene, but man, the quality of work and the craftsmanship that I've seen come out of this place is insane. And with a 4-to-1 gear set and, you know, with twin stick, and it's so much lighter and more compact, this is like the perfect option for a build like this. Finally broke down, ran up to Harbor Freight, and got some stands for this lift. This is long overdue, but this is going to make it so much easier for me to figure out how to build all the cross members while at the same time safely holding the transmission above my head. I'm at a point now where I've got some hard decisions to make. I want to be able to pull the transfer case out without removing any bars. The problem is if we make any of these bars like removable, like if we cut in some sort of like a plate system or anything like that, as these take impacts over time, it'll make it to where if I remove that, it will not go back in. I know better than that. But if we just like welded this in as it is, we'd be able to pull the transfer case and drop it right here, which would be great. But these bars are so much stronger if you can tie them together. So what I'm thinking of doing right now is I think if I remove this cross member here and I do tie in this entire belly system together in a way that makes it all like one unit instead of 3 individual units, I should theoretically still be able to pull the transfer case and slip it out of the back. And then I'll be able to leave that bottom part alone if I ever have to pull the T-case in the future. So, I don't know. I'm going over this with in my head of different ways that I could do this, and right now, that seems like the best route. What you don't see in these videos is me standing and staring at my projects and thinking in my head of the best route forward. And I immediately changed direction and decided to take advantage of that rear double height cross member. I think that this has got a huge benefit in rigidity, and it's going to give us a really nice solid mounting point for the rear suspension. I'm just going to have to leave a gap in between the front and the back cross members to make sure that I still have enough space to remove the transfer case without taking out the whole engine and transmission and everything else. couple months ago, whenever I was chopping all the cross members out of this that were already there, I had this really big low-hanging cross member that was there just to keep everything together and stay out of the way. Well, now I've been able to figure out exactly what size cross member I need without it being too low. And so we're finally at a point that once I get a bunch of stuff tacked together, we can chop that initial cross member out. And I was even able to clock the transfer case up just a little bit, but it's still, I mean, it's so close to the body, there's only so much you can do. It goes without saying that these cross members have multiple jobs, but the reason that I designed this and the way that I did is because there are certain jobs that are going to be unique to these cross members that we wouldn't necessarily find in other applications. So first things first, the cross member's basic job is just to connect the passenger side of the frame rail to the driver's side. But the front portion of this cross member is also going to end up being mounts for our lower control arms for our suspension. We're going to get rid of these mounts that we had initially because once we got the drivetrain in there, we realized that things are going to need to change around a little bit. We have some packaging issues with our springs and stuff. So the front part of the cross member is going to be for lower control arm brackets. It also needs to hold up our transmission, which is attached to our transfer case. So it has a really important job. And because of that, I designed it to where we have like 3 cross members that are all tied together in multiple ways. And a lot of people don't know, tube is really slippery actually off-road. So I didn't want to have to do like a big skid plate. I would rather do tube because from a structural standpoint, I think that it's going to be a lot stronger for a lot longer. Now, because of how tall we're going to have to make the Samurai, I don't think we're going to nail the belly very often. Now, we will occasionally, obviously, but compared to our breakover angle should be pretty awesome in this truck. Compared to how long the wheelbase is and how high the belly is, I don't think we're going to have an issue. But any time that we do hit it, this is pretty beefy in the way that it's designed, and it should be able to take plenty of impacts without any sort of distortion and doing anything too crazy. Now, the rear cross members, I designed it very similar to the front, but because I had the opportunity to add an upper cross member that it ties into the upper part of the frame rails, that's going to give us rigidity in like keeping things from sliding side to side. Now, a lot of like factory frames and stuff don't have like a full-size cross member that would go from the top of the frame to the bottom of the frame. But when I saw the opportunity to use this and I'd already bent the cross member up, I was like, man, this is going to add a level of rigidity for very little. There's very little cons associated here. So I decided to keep that cross member, and it's going to make the rear suspension, because the rear suspension is going to tie into these cross members, it's going to give us a really stout place to mount. Now, why do I have this big gap in the middle here? This big gap makes it to where I can get the transfer case in and out without having to pull the engine and transmission. I'm trying to think of future Nate here as I'm designing this stuff. I'm going to be the one to service it. If we ever have an issue with the transfer case, or if we decided to switch gears or whatever, it'd be nice to be able to pull it out independently and not have to rip out the engine and transmission in order to do so, because everything's so tight in the engine bay. Pulling the engine and transmission is going to suck unless I pull the whole front end off, and it would suck to have to pull the whole front end off to then pull the engine and transmission just to get to the transfer case. So now, why is the transfer case clocked down so much? Well, we do not have hardly any clearance because this body was not made for a transfer case like this. And if you look at the factory Samurai transfer case, it's clocked down quite a bit just like this. Yes, I could chop more body away, but man, we've already chopped a lot. and we're already going to have a lot of sheet metal work to do to cover all this stuff, and it's going to get even more complicated if I cut it even farther back. So I decided to just make the most out of the situation. Regardless, we will have to have a 2-piece front drive shaft, so having it clocked the way it is, it's just not the end of the world. Ideally, I would love to have it higher. Now, we could clock that flat if we dropped the engine, but if we drop the engine, we hit this weird front axle. And this is just the chain of events that happen whenever you try to make junkyard parts fit other junkyard parts. You're gonna have to make compromises, and a lot of times that will like link to a whole bunch of other problems. So the compromise that I have found with this build so far is exactly as it sits. I've thought about every single avenue extensively, and this is what I think is going to be the best combination of parts and pieces. And now that we have it in there, we can talk about how do you select a transfer case and why. I'm going to tell you exactly how I choose a transfer case, what my targets are, whether you have a manual or an automatic, and hopefully this will help some of you choose a transfer case in the future. So with the TJ, we had a 4-to-1 or 4.01 to 1 first gear, manual transmission. Very important. There's a big difference between manuals and automatics when it comes to rock crawling. It had a 4-speed Atlas transfer case, meaning that it had a normal 2-speed transfer case. It's a high and low range, right? 1-to-1 and then usually like 2.72 or whatever the common is for the vehicle you own. But on top of that, it had a 2-to-1 reduction box in front of it, giving us a final of 5.44 to 1. Super low. It was great. Axle, 5.38. Very common gear set for people who rock crawl, especially if you do 40s or bigger. If you're a Toyota guy, it'd be like 529. And so if you can get your T-case set up like this, your final is going to be a 117.36 to 1 crawl ratio. And I found this, with a 39, I found this to be perfect. Like, it was so good. It wasn't so slow that it was like worthless, because some people will get 200, 300, like crazy low, but I never found it necessary to go any lower than this. This made it, especially with the diesel engine, feel like an on and off switch with that clutch. I never smelt clutch from having to burn it up when crawling big rocks or obstacles. And when you can crawl slow like this, it's great in snow because you can slowly let out and your tires don't just dig. Because sometimes, depending on the type of snow you're in, if it's fluffy and it's really deep fluffy, you're going to want to dig every time, you know, you start to give a little bit of throttle, and then that torque converter has that delay before it starts to turn the tires. This is a really nice way to get around that. It was amazing. Honestly, it drove like a dream on big obstacles, small obstacles, everything. With the Zook, we have the same transmission, basically 4-to-1. We have the Midnight Metalworks 2-speed transfer case that's a 4-to-1. So as you can see, it's not geared down quite as low as the Atlas, but you could do a doubler on the Midnight Metalworks if you needed it. But to me, the big selling point of the Midnight Metalworks is that it's a smaller, lighter case, and with 4-to-1 gears, you get a lot of flexibility, and especially when you're going with axles that are geared as low as these are. These are a 7.56 to 1 gear ratio because it reduces on the hubs. There's a reduction, of course, in the center section, and this gives us a 1.21 to 1 final ratio, crawl ratio. So it's so similar to how the TJ was, and with this being a slightly more powerful engine, about 1,000 pounds lighter, and removing weight away from that 4-speed case and putting it in the axles, this is gonna feel like it's glued to everything, and it's gonna be ultra controllable. This is gonna be outstanding. Now, as far as what you should choose, if you've got a manual, and there's plenty of websites where you can calculate this stuff out. Like, I didn't do any math on paper. I just go online, you just type in crawl ratio calculator. It'll ask you for these digits, and this will help you plan how to gear your axles, what transmissions you should be looking at, or if you've already got you've already got your transmission picked out and all the other stuff, this will help you figure out, what transfer case you should be doing, or if you need a doubler, any of that. But with a manual, I recommend a minimum of 100 to 1 if you want to do serious off-road. If you're an overlander, forget all this. It doesn't really matter. If you're someone that likes to tool around on really hard obstacles, you like to, try to find that right line for those tires and chew on things really slow, you're going to burn up your transmission or your clutch really quickly if you're geared too high. So with an automatic,
Things get a lot better around 60-1, but personally, I would, with an automatic, I would still want at least an 80-1. It's just, this is a nice target, like minimum. Otherwise, rock crawling sucks. Like, and my Toyota, it has transmission temperature issues because the transfer case is just not geared low enough. I have the lowest axle ratios, but I need it to be able to crawl slower to alleviate all that extra heat that builds up in the transmission. So these are my two targets that I recommend. Now, should you get an Atlas, or should you get a Midnight Metalworks, or should you just find like a used transmission, or sorry, transfer case in a junkyard? The best transfer case that you can find as far as like stock gearing is gonna end up being one of the Rubicon cases. It's one of the few companies that have a 4-to-1 transfer case stock, and it's honestly, it is a huge game changer for factory off-road vehicles. The problem is they're all super expensive. Sometimes you'll see a guy who got one for 1,200 bucks or something, but usually they're like $2 grand. And if you're gonna spend $2 grand on a used case, and you can't even do front digs with it or anything because you can't do like a twin stick, I don't know. It starts to get hard to pull the trigger and spend that kind of money when you could start looking at something like a Midnight Metalworks. It's a more compact case. There's a bunch of different options for clocking because of the way it's machined. You have different transfer case gear options, and then you can do front digs because you have a you basically have a lever that controls the rear axle separate from a lever that controls the front axle. So you can put the rear in neutral, put the front in low or high, and now you can do a front dig, which is awesome. It's really nice for turning. You can pull the e-brake and you can turn around stuff really tight, or you can warm up the front tires and launch up that obstacle with some stickier tires. There's so many options that are unlocked when you use an aftermarket case. So it's a big investment up front for either one of these, for an Atlas or for the Midnight Metalworks. But the way I look at them is, for your average person, if you just have like one 4x4 at a time, it's like a lifetime investment. You could buy one of these cases, and because you can change the input, because you can change it on your bench at home to be from a driver's side drop to a passenger side drop, you can make all these changes yourself. It makes it to where you can take it out of your Cherokee and you could put it in your Toyota if you decide to change platforms. Or you could put it in, you know, even a Land Rover, whatever. As long as it's got the right input shaft going into it, you can change all this stuff around, and this could be like a lifetime investment. So it just depends on which ones of these things apply to you and what you're building your vehicle for. Again, overlanders, you don't really need to look at this. Basically, any modern four-wheel drive, the transfer case that comes with it is fine. I would just use the crawl ratio calculator to figure out what gears you should use in your axles. But outside of that, if you're not doing really complicated off-road, just doing the occasional rocks that are on a dirt road, you don't really need to know any of this stuff. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. We made a bunch of progress on the Samurai. Next week, my buddy Bobby is coming up and he's gonna help me for the week. And I'm hoping in the next video we can get 100% of the suspension buttoned up. So we'll see you then. Thanks for watching.